Hi, welcome to Pyrography Made Easy. I'm Brenda. Today I'm going to show you the different techniques that I use to fix mistakes and hide grain lines in pyrography. This video is broken down into 4 sections. The first is how to lighten burns that got too dark. The second is fixing mistakes. The third is handling seam lines. And the fourth is dealing with grain lines. As always, down in the description I have a table of contents. If you click on the time, it will take you instantly to that section of the video. I am going to start with ways to lighten areas that got too dark, so let's get started. Firmly rub a standard ink eraser over the area you want to lighten. Ink erasers are gray in color and have a gritty feel to them. Some might know them as typewriter erasers, and more recently I've seen them called sand erasers. Now be aware that ink erasers will only lighten the area by a few shades. So unless the burn strokes are really pale, it's never going to completely remove the burn. Now ink erasers are a great way to add soft, subtle highlights. But since they don't keep a point, I don't consider them good for areas where you need precision. Here's the before and after picture, and you can see that the ink eraser reduced the darkness level by a few shades, but it didn't come close to removing all of the burn marks. Be careful when using dark erasers on plywood, as tiny bits of the eraser can get embedded in the slivers if they are deep enough. Slivers are what I call the missing pieces of wood that all plywood has. I found this out the hard way with my Nevesky Cathedral artwork. The area I used the eraser on was pale with deep slivering, so now I have this dirty looking spot on the artwork. I also use a spot sanding pen. It is made out of fiberglass and is designed to remove rust from metal, so it is very abrasive. I like the spot sander because of its small tip and it keeps its shape. Hold the spot sander like a pencil and use a very light pressure when rubbing it over the area. The eraser is really abrasive and it can quickly gouge channels into the wood, so I can't emphasize enough the need to use a light pressure. As you can see in this before and after picture, a considerable amount of color was removed from the burn. After you use a fiberglass eraser, make sure to thoroughly clean the wood afterwards. Begin by rubbing over the area with an eraser. Any standard pencil eraser will work. And then use a damp paper towel and rub over the area again. Allow the wood to dry before doing anything more. Another item I like to use is a scraper, like this box cutter knife. I have several, and which one I use depends on the size of the area I want to lighten up. The box cutter is my largest scraper. When you use a scraper like this, use the flat top of the knife to gently scrape away layers of color. With enough scraping, you can remove all of the burn marks, but depending on how dark the burn is, this could take a while to accomplish. Here's the before and after picture that shows how well the scraper lightened up the burn area. There are a lot of people who also use sandpaper to lighten burns and fix mistakes. Sandpaper works great, but I seldom use it, mostly because it doesn't fit in my little tool jar I keep next to my workstation. Since it's out of sight, it's out of mind. Well, now we're going to move on to techniques that I use to fix blotches, overburns, and other pyrography mistakes. So let's watch that. I have a dark blotch under the crow's foot that I am removing using an X-Acto knife. Pay attention to how I'm holding the knife so that I use the flat edge of the blade. Do not use the pointed tip of the blade, as that will just dig holes into the wood. Use a light pressure and make many passes scraping at the area. This will give you much better results than pressing hard and trying to remove the color in 1 or 2 passes of the knife. As you can see from the composite photo, the blotch isn't completely gone, but it is considerably lighter. This photo shows an overburn that occurred when I was burning too close to the edge and didn't have my pen in optimal position. Again, I'm using the flat edge of an X-Acto knife to gently scrape away the overburned area. Notice how it takes me a number of passes before I have removed all of the color. As you can see, removing pale color with precision is easily accomplished using an X-Acto knife. With the scalloped seashells, I wanted to remove the dark tan line that's running horizontally just above the white reflection. I also wanted to remove a thin vertical line. Again, I'm using the flat of an X-Acto knife to gently scrape over the problem area. The key is to take your time and scrape gently until enough color has been removed that the dark tan line is gone and it blends in with the surroundings. And sometimes it helps to rotate the wood because that will make it easier to see the spot that you want to remove. As you can see, the dark tan line is now gone. With the golden eagle, I want to fix the sunken grain lines. To fix this problem, I use a micro writer pen tip on low heat and burn in those sunken grain lines. Now, I cannot emphasize enough the need to use low heat. Grain lines darken up really fast, so I keep the heat set around 1 or 2 at the highest, and then I reburn over it to slowly build up the color. If I tried to burn in the sunken grain lines at the same heat setting I did for the rest of the feather, I'd end up with a black line. It would just darken up so quick. As you can see, this didn't completely fix the problem. That's because there were a lot of lines to fix, and I got tired of working on it. But it does look a lot better. The next thing I want to discuss are seam lines. Seam lines are where 2 boards are joined together. This picture shows a board with 2 seam lines, but sometimes it can be hard to see them. If you look at the end cut of the board, if there are seam lines present, they'll be a lot easier to see. Well, let me show you how I handle seam lines. My best advice for seam lines is to avoid burning on them. This is done by burning above and below the line, but avoid burning over the line as much as possible. The reason is the glue in the seam line darkens really fast and at a very low heat. It darkens faster than grain lines do, and it's difficult to remove the color without creating a shallow channel or a groove along that seam line. And to me, the channel or the groove looks almost as bad as the dark line, so I burn very carefully around seam lines. If you do have a seam line in your board, take into careful consideration where you place your design. For the artwork in this example, I had to choose between placing the seam line so that it went across the child's forehead or his chin. I picked the chin because there was more stuff going on in this general area, and I thought I could hide that seam line better. So here is the picture of the final artwork, and the seam line is visible, but I like to think that it isn't as noticeable as it would have been if I had placed the seam line so that it showed up along the forehead. Generally, if a board has any seam lines in it, there will only be one or two, so that makes it pretty easy to avoid them. Grain lines, on the other hand, tend to be a lot more plentiful, making it a lot harder to avoid them. Speaking of grain lines, you need to be realistic on what can be fixed. For example, some of the grain lines on this flower are really noticeable. I can't remove them, so the best I can do is minimize how dark they get. So let's examine ways to deal with grain lines. I'm using an X-Acto knife to gently scrape along the grain lines to lighten how dark they got. Again, I'm using the flat edge of the blade to do the scraping. I never use the pointed tip of the blade as it digs into the wood, pitting and gouging the surface. As you can see, I can remove the dark color that occurred from burning over the grain line, but I can't remove the grain lines, especially dark grain lines. They're going to remain. So the best I can do is incorporate them into the shadows on the flowers. This method doesn't always work, but when it does, it's great. With this cluster of flowers, I wanted to remove the charring on the grain line that runs horizontally on the flowers. To do this, I'm using an X-Acto knife to very gently scrape on the grain line. It's important to keep a light pressure when doing this. Go slow. This is very precise work as you only want to scrape on the grain line. Again, it takes many light passes with the knife to remove the charring without gouging a channel or a groove into the wood. Often when doing this type of work, it can be very beneficial to rotate the wood and scrape on the line from a different angle. Some angles are much easier to see what you're doing than others. But the key is to work slow, scrape gently, and only scrape on the grain line. It took a bit of work, but the charring on the grain line is gone. With the mushroom, I need to remove or lighten the grain line that got dark when I burned over it, and I also need to burn in the sunken grain line next to it. First, I scrape along the grain line to remove some of the color and lighten it up. Now go slow because you only need to remove enough color so that it blends in. Now I've found that an X-Acto knife works best in this situation because I need such precision. After I'm done scraping, then I switch to a micro writer pen tip and I turn my unit on low. So that's going to be about 1 or 2. My unit goes to 10. And I slowly burn in the sunken grain line. I repeatedly burn over the area until it blends in with the area around it. Here's a before and after picture, and I think it's pretty hard to tell where the problem was. On this shell, I need to remove color from the darkened grain line, and then I need to burn in the sunken grain line to match the shell. Again, always use the flat edge of the knife when scraping. Never use the pointed tip of the knife as it's so easy to gouge and pit the wood with it. Take your time and gently scrape on the grain line until the color has been reduced enough that it blends in with the surroundings. Remember to use a very low heat when burning in the sunken grain lines. Grain lines darken up very easily, and sunken grain lines are no exception to this rule. The snail shell is different than the mushroom because I have to match the color on the growth rings that intersect through the grain lines. In places where there are shadows under the growth rings, I have to darken up the sunken grain lines to match that color. Along the top or the ridge of a growth ring, the color is paler, so again I have to match that. All I do is reburn as needed until the color or darkness level matches the growth rings that run through it at the spot I am working. One of the most important things when burning on sunken grain lines is to keep the heat at a very low setting. Low heat will keep the grain line from turning black and allow you to reburn over the line until the color matches the surroundings. This before and after picture shows how well this technique I use to hide grain lines works. This last example has a lot more tonal variations in it, but the method of scraping doesn't change. Always use the flat of the knife, exerting a very light pressure to gently scrape along the darkened grain line. It can take numerous passes before enough color is removed to hide the grain line. When burning in sunken grain lines, always use low heat and a small writer pen tip. Reburn as needed to make the color on the sunken grain line match the shell's growth rings that intersect it. As you can see, it is possible to hide grain lines in pyrography. That's it for this tutorial. I hope I was able to provide some useful tips and techniques to fix problems and deal with grain lines. I would love to know what techniques you use to fix mistakes, so leave me a comment and let me know about it. Well, thank you for watching, and I will see you next week.